Well, we know that Senate Democrats have a very, very rough road ahead of them in the 2026 Senate race. Democrats are left defending 4 or 5 very vulnerable seats. Meanwhile, Republicans are promising to plow millions and millions of dollars into these races to grow their majorities in the Senate for the second half of Donald Trump's term. But today, we're going to be focused on the most vulnerable Democrat in 2026. I will start by saying, people in consideration for this spot it'd be a much larger group of people, but there are 3 Democrats who decided not to run in vulnerable seats. You have Tina Smith in Minnesota, Jeanine Shaheen in New Hampshire, and Gary Peters in Michigan. Which brings us to one person left, one very vulnerable Democrat, a state that President Trump won in 2024, a state that President Trump won in 2016. That brings us to Mr. Jon Ossoff of the great state of Georgia. Now, Jon Ossoff is a freshman senator elected in 2020 in a runoff election against incumbent senator at the time, David Perdue, in which that election, Georgia allowed Democrats to take control of the Senate and ultimately take control of the entire government from 2021 till 23 when the Republicans won back the House. During that time period, Democrats passed some of the most radical leftist bills imaginable. The radical climate scam initiatives through the reconciliation process, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which allowed Biden to pump trillions into the economy, which drove inflation through the roof. He pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. That's what happened here. And the Inflation Reduction Act had nothing to do with inflation or reducing inflation. It had to do with pushing green initiatives. And that's really the overarching theme of the Biden administration, is they would try and do something good. And I don't think they tried to do something good, but like the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act could have been good. But how did they screw the CHIPS Act up? They went in and put all of these DEI, diversity, equity, all these stipulations where if you wanted to apply for one of these grants or for a loan from the federal government, you had to meet certain quotas. You had to meet certain diversity standards or equity standards. You had to have equity plans. That is the issue with Democrats. It's the overregulation is what killed them. And that's exactly what they did. Not only did they pump trillions of dollars into the economy and cause inflation to spike to almost 10%, but they killed American business by regulations. They tried to regulate at every step of the way because ultimately, all of these people that they're paying these student loans off for, that they're giving loan forgiveness to, who are going to school to get a degree in, environmental studies or gender ideology or lesbian dance theory, those people ultimately need a job, and the only way they're going to get a job is if the government creates, 50 layers of administrative work to pull a roof permit, or to get a permit to build a factory. If there's only 10 layers of regulations, there aren't as many jobs that are provided. But if you put 50 layers in there, well, then all of a sudden, all of your gender theory, environmental study majors, all of a sudden now have a job. It's kind of ridiculous. But Democrats took control of the federal government in 2021, and we just had to deal with the fact they took control of it. But now we have an extremely, extremely vulnerable Democrat, very vulnerable Democrat, who is up for re-election in 2026. But to fully understand this, we do have to take a look in the past. The reality is that Georgia right now is a purple state. It is a purple state that has been trending to the left for about a decade now. But although it's a purple state that's trending to the left, it also has a lot of right leanings within inside of it. It has been trending to the left. It does not mean it is a left-wing state or a blue state or a lean blue state. This is a state that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 by about 5 points, I believe. And we can get the official pulled up right here. Voted for Trump by about 5 points in 2016. Voted for Biden by 0.24, which was what? Biden won the state by, what, 12,000 votes, 11,000 votes? Then to 2024, when Donald Trump was able to win the state again by about 2.2 points over the Democrat nominee, or Democrat-appointed presidential nominee, Kamala Harris. This is a purple state. And although, and there's a lot of nuance that goes into this, although it is a purple state at the federal level, if you look at the state level, this really isn't a purple state. This is definitely a right-leaning state at the state level. But at the federal level, when you pull federal politics into it, it leans to the left. Look at 2022. Look at what happened. I guess you have to go all the way back to 2021 to fully understand where this started. 2020, 2021. Jon Ossoff was running against David Perdue, and Raphael Warnock was running in a special election against Kelly Loeffler. This was a horrible election for the Republican Party. Jon Ossoff ended up winning in a runoff by about a point, and Warnock won in a runoff by about 2 points. It was a very unfortunate election that handed power over to the Democrats in D.C. Now, fast forward to 2022. Now, 2020, there was a leftward shift, a huge leftward shift. So we're going to just kind of excuse this for right now. But jump forward to 2022. Raphael Warnock ran for re-election against the Republican-appointed nominee Herschel Walker. Raphael Warnock ended up winning re-election by about 2.8 points. It is so unfortunate that this happened. Because in this same election, when Raphael Warnock won re-election by almost 3 points, in that same election, literally the same ballot, incumbent Governor Brian Kemp won re-election in Georgia by 7.5 points. So obviously, with the state Republican Party, something is working. Messaging is working with the state Republican Party. But when it comes to the National Republican Party in Georgia, the policies of the National Republicans are not attractive. They have, or at least in Herschel Walker, they were not attractive. I think partly it was the politics of the policy, or the policies of the party. But now I think 2024, I think the Republican policies are much, much, much more popular than they ever have been. But it came down to candidate quality in that election. Candidate quality had so much to do with it. Herschel Walker was not this polished stone. You know, people like to play this Trump effect. Well, Trump was able to win in 2016 as this really unpolished, rough around the edges candidate. Voters give Donald Trump a lot of leeway. They then turn around and look at their more locally elected leaders, and they hold them to a much higher standard. It is very true that the American electorate holds Donald Trump to one standard and every other politician to another standard. That is just the reality. Look at Kari Lake. Look at Herschel Walker. Look at Mehmet Oz. Look at Blake Masters. They hold Donald Trump to a different standard than they hold other Republicans to. And it's very evident because meanwhile, the Democrat nominee or senator was elected in 2022. At the same time, we saw the entire control of the Georgia executive branch, the government of Georgia, and the legislative branch were all controlled by Republicans. Republicans have a major trifecta in the executive branch and the legislature. Every statewide elected office is held by a Republican. Every single one. Every single one. The House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans. And the Senate, also controlled by Republicans. So Republicans in the state of Georgia know how to win. It is when you have these hand-picked candidates that do not resonate well, where you have the MAGA base was able to really lift up Herschel Walker. That's what they were able to do. Did not mean he was going to be the most popular and the best candidate to run. But as you can see, things are very, very dicey in this state. But one thing is very clear. State Republicans have been able to outdo national Republicans in the state of Georgia. State Republicans have the infrastructure in place to energize voters and can buck national trends. Just look even at in 2022. It's like we're going to keep going back to this because it's a huge data point. Huge data point. You want to look at 2022. These are the governor's races. You had a really close governor's race in Arizona. 2022 was supposed to be a landslide for the Republican Party. It ended up being kind of this little red trickle. We did not see it. The Democrats overperformed in many, many states. It was not a great election. It just wasn't. You know, on the governor's level, you know, Katie Hobbs was able to beat out Kari Lake. Nevada was kind of the one place where Republicans really overperformed, where Democrats were supposed to do better, like a lot better, and where they actually won the race. Look at Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro won by about 15 points from the Trump-appointed, Trump-picked candidate. Instead of going with the Republicans, the establishment Republicans in the state, the conservative Republicans in the state who know how to win statewide. Instead of going with them, who they have the infrastructure, they've built out the pipeline of candidates to do this. Instead, Trump came in, appointed a hand-picked successor in these states, and it didn't work out. It didn't work out in Pennsylvania. It didn't work out in Michigan. It didn't work out in Wisconsin. It didn't. Now, Jensen wasn't really handpicked by Trump, but didn't work out in Minnesota. Where did it work out, though? Didn't work out in Kansas either, where you had a Democrat win in the state of Kansas. Kansas voted for Trump by 16 points, but they voted for a Democrat governor by 2 points? Really the only place that we saw this kind of red wave, a red wave where they actually won where they weren't supposed to, Nevada. Where was the red wave? Georgia and Florida. Governor DeSantis won re-election by almost 20 points. You go back to 2018, DeSantis was elected by 0.39 percentage points. Brian Kemp was elected by 1.5 points. Fast forward to 2022. Brian Kemp expanded his margins from about 1.5 points to 7.5 points. Governor DeSantis of Florida expanded his margin from 0.39 percentage points to almost 20 percentage points in the state. That is where the red wave was. That was where the Republicans, who had the infrastructure in place, they had the ability to take resources and allocate them properly on advertisements, staff training, campaigning, that to be able to energize voters and buck national trends. That's what they did here. That's how these Republicans won. These were the hotly contested governor's races that the Republicans were able to win by a relatively good margin. An increase, but at the same time, when there was a maybe not the best candidate that should have been in that race, you look how different that race looks. Georgia, Arizona. It's like you look. There's so many places you can look. You look in Wisconsin. You had a good Republican senator who won re-election. You look in Pennsylvania, Mehmet Oz. You literally had someone who was basically brain dead, who had a stroke, who literally has mental faculties, win this election by 5 points. You had a Democrat in the state of Georgia that voted almost 10 points to the left of where they voted for governor. To represent them at the national level, they wanted a Democrat. On the state level, the state executive, they wanted a Republican. You look at Arizona. Mark Kelly was able to win his re-election, by almost 5 points over hand-picked Blake Masters. That's just the reality of the situation here. You even had, it is very, very unfortunate what they did, but this really plays into it. This really plays into the fact of Jon Ossoff and exactly why he is going to be the most vulnerable Democrat in 2026 in those Senate elections. We know Jon Ossoff is a liberal who voted with Joe Biden 98% of the time. 98% of the time, he voted with Joe Biden. I mean, we're talking Inflation Reduction Act, which was really just the Green New scam. We're talking the CHIPS Act. We're talking the infrastructure bill that they passed, the American Rescue Act. He has to remember, Jon Ossoff, you represent a purple state. And you are very easily could be facing a very popular governor in 2026. A very popular governor in 26. Who already has, Mike Collins must have announced that he is not going to be running for this race here. Well, publicly expressed interest if Kemp doesn't run. Okay, I see. Throwing his support behind it. This is exactly what we should be doing. Throwing our support behind a popular governor in Brian Kemp. He knows how to win in the state. Let's let him win. Stop trying to meddle in elections where you do not know how to win in. If you're going to meddle in the Ohio or Kentucky Senate race, okay, whatever. It really doesn't matter that much. Or Oklahoma. We're going to win it by 30 points. We're going to win it by 6 points. We're going to win it by 20 points. But if you start doing that in swing states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, the results speak for themselves. The results say enough. And where there were strong Republican candidates, you saw wins. Ron Johnson, Marco Rubio. You flip over to the governor's race in 22. DeSantis, Brian Kemp won. You look at these Republicans winning. You have Phil Scott winning by 47 points in Vermont, a state that voted for Kamala Harris by 31 points, also voted for Scott by 51 points. You look at New Hampshire. That's where the red wave was. The red wave was in New Hampshire, in Vermont, in Florida. That is where it was. And, along with Brian Kemp, a very popular governor, most likely jumping in this race, Jon Ossoff is also going to have to deal with the fact that he has a decent amount of political baggage. One large piece of political baggage he has is his vote on Israel. In November of 2024, Jon Ossoff joined Raphael Warnock and 15 other Democrats and backed 2 failed Senate measures that would have blocked selling mortar rounds and tank ammunition to Israel amid its war with Hamas right now. And this sparked a huge firestorm among Georgia's Jewish community. Jon Ossoff is the state's first Jewish senator who was sworn in on a Hebrew scripture in 2021. Over 50 Atlanta Jewish institutions slammed him and obliterated him. Even his childhood rabbi called him out. Some heavy-hitting Jewish donors even wrote private letters to GOP Governor Brian Kemp urging him to run against Ossoff in 2026, promising a, quote, loyal allies and, quote, strong supporters if he were to run. This just shows the rift with a key demographic in the state, in Atlanta, in these suburbs, where Ossoff needs to win. If he wants to win, he just has to. He cannot afford to shed much support. It's like you're looking at 2020. He just can't. He cannot afford to lose. He can't afford to shed a lot of support. This is a thin race. Very, very thin. He didn't even win in the first round. Jon Ossoff didn't even win the popular vote, but because David Perdue didn't hit 50%, it went to a runoff. Like, this is where we are at. He didn't even win in the popular vote the first time around. It was only the second time after, Trump started denying the election, saying he didn't lose, really ramped things up for Jon Ossoff to win in that runoff election. Another sore spot for him is immigration. The Republicans have been hammering Jon Ossoff over his vote on the Laken Riley Act. This was a bill named after a Georgia nursing student who was murdered by an illegal, undocumented immigrant. Ossoff voted for it in May of 2024. But Republicans point to his earlier opposition to the tougher GOP amendment in March. He ultimately, went ahead and did vote for it. But when the measures were the most restrictive and the toughest on illegal immigration, he voted against it. It wasn't until it would be a political liability for him that he decided that he was going to vote for it. It just shows how spineless he is. He has this spineless complacency on open borders. And this is a state where border security, according to the polls, is very hot, especially with rural and suburban conservatives. This could really, really stick. We know immigration is a top issue for Republicans and right-leaning individuals, and especially if Kemp jumps in this race, who has seriously distanced himself from Donald Trump in a lot of ways, but still, he has distanced himself from Trump when it comes to the 2020 election. Almost on everything else, he still is this law and order strongman candidate. That is who Brian Kemp, he still is this strongman candidate, this law and order candidate. And Jon Ossoff just is not. Jon Ossoff is going to be really welded at the waist to a lot of the Biden spending packages that he helped pass through the reconciliation process, like the American Rescue Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. All of these acts, which maybe some in theory would have been good, were just horrible in reality. They were caught up. Red tape has basically held everything down. A lot of funding has not been dispersed because of the amount of red tape. They want businesses to qualify for these grants or these loans to meet certain DEI initiatives. They want them to meet, equity They want them to have equity plans. They want them to have quotas for females and underrepresented populations. And then really the big one, the big piece of political baggage that Jon Ossoff is going to have is his vote against Protecting in Women and Girls Sports Act of 2025. This is really shaping up to be a notable piece of legislation and piece of political baggage as he will head into the 2026 re-election bid in Georgia. This Senate bill that was pushed by Republicans aimed to bar women, I should say transgender women or mentally ill biological males, from competing in women's sports at federally funded institutions. Now, Ossoff, along with every other voting Democrat, blocked it in a 51-45 procedural vote in March, which fell short of the 60 vote threshold they needed to advance it, to invoke cloture on it. And it could 100% weigh him down, and we've got some data to show how this will weigh him down. So there was a poll conducted. This Senegal poll right here. This was a poll in which, we'll start it off, Jon Ossoff was tied 44-44 with a generic Republican. And in this same poll, they showed that upwards of 80% of Americans, including 67% of Democrats, oppose transgender women or mentally ill men from competing in women's sports. And in Georgia, in this same poll right here that had Ossoff tied with a generic Republican, when voters were told in this poll that he voted to allow biological males to play in women's sports, it flipped to a 52-38 advantage for the GOP. So it went from an even playing field 44-44 to a 14-point advantage for the GOP. That is a 14-point swing this is brutal, in a state that Donald Trump won by 2 points in 2024. Independents, who broke 60% negative on Trump in this poll. Trump had a negative approval rating with independents. Might not love the culture war, but they are not sold on Ossoff. They might not love Trump, but they know when you get down to the actual policies, they like the policies. And 48% viewed Kemp favorably in this poll right here. There's even some polls that we have where Brian Kemp's approval rating, not his favorability, but his approval rating, upwards of 60% in the state. Meanwhile, Jon Ossoff is below 50% in those same polls. And you can see it right here. Jon Ossoff in Poland does not beat a single other Republican. Even the generic Republican, he's tied. Brad Raffensperger, Buddy Carter, John King, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mike Collins, Rich McCormick. Look, I like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think she's a fighter. Do I think she's the best candidate to be the senator from Georgia? No, I don't. Let's not do that. Let's do everything we can to get Brian Kemp to jump in this race. But we know that in 2024, Donald Trump, one of the most effective messaging that he had to do with the transgender advertisement. It was the Donald Trump is for they, them. Kamala Harris is for they, them. Donald Trump is for you. That was Donald Trump's most effective ad in the 2024 election. This may be some evidence that Republicans should be leaning in to this. They should be leaning into these transgender issues in the 2026 election. You know, when you're seeing a 14-point swing, you're seeing 44-44 to 52-38 when they're told about this. That is the margin that we need. Even if that doesn't exactly convert into a 14-point swing in an electoral, like in an election, even if it swings 10% of that in an election, even if it swings a point and a half or 20% at 3 percentage points, that can make or break an election that, like we said, initially went for the Republican in 2020. It went for the Republican by almost 90,000 votes, but then in the runoff went for Jon Ossoff by roughly about a point and a half. That is the reality of the situation we're in. So a combination of the political baggage with Jon Ossoff, a very popular governor in this race, and a well-funded GOP candidate with good infrastructure like Brian Kemp could be huge for the Republican Party. Huge. And we know the National Senatorial Republican Committee already said they are going to look to plow tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into this race to flip this race. They consider this the most vulnerable Democrat. They see this as their biggest opportunity to pick up a seat. And let's listen to the state Republicans in Georgia. They have the infrastructure built out. They have the ability to mobilize voters. Even when Democrats win the national election, they're able to mobilize voters to vote for the Republican candidates. Let's trust that these Republicans know what they're doing. And if it shows that they don't know what they're doing, we need to step in. But ultimately, we need infrastructure from the bottom up if you're going to win these midterms elections. Infrastructure from the top down worked in 2024. Don't get me wrong. But we saw a couple days ago in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, unless you have the infrastructure from the ground up, throwing $25 million at the race does nothing if you do not have the infrastructure to properly use that funding. But all in all, this could be huge trouble for Jon Ossoff in this race. There is still a lot about this race that we don't know. Candidates who haven't jumped in the race, waiting on decisions from Brian Kemp. There's still a lot that's going to unfold. And Jon Ossoff still has another year and a half to really trip over himself, to really prove why he is not deserving to be the senator from Georgia. So that is going to wrap things up for today, folks. Drop down below, hit that subscribe button. Don't ever miss another video from us again in the future, and we will catch you next time.